Tight Moon, we are out here providing you with the money glitch, and all you have to do is deliver. We got the patron request from Puffy. Say that Nasu actually does the unthinkable and branches out to do an IP collab that isn't tied to Tight Moon in any way. Out of all the servants that we have, who do you think one out of each class would Nasu be willing to hand over? By the way, if you haven't already, make sure you guys sign up for the Patreon. You get access to early content and priority on your request. I'm actually surprised that Tight Moon hasn't acted on this beforehand, considering just how much we know it could bring in. Who would be the best characters for a fighting game collab? Now, Puffy wanted me to use Smash Brothers as the base, but I don't play Smash and I haven't in years, so I'm gonna speak to something more modern to me, like Tekken and Under Night. But first, I want to lay out some things that I've noticed from the collabs that we do have. I went over some of the collabs that we had in the past years, the ones that we had regarding FGO, and they actually have quite a few of them. It's just that none of them directly pertains to FGO. They always keep FGO to themselves because they know their worth, and more importantly, I think they're just afraid to branch out without seeing the real mutual benefit beforehand. You know, just looking through the list, a lot of these games I've never even heard of. You know, they've collabed with Shadowverse, which is another mobile game. I've heard of that one. Unison League, Valkyrie Connect. They just recently did one with Divine Gate. They've done Battle Cats, Puzzles and Dragons, a lot of titles that you probably wouldn't expect. One thing that I noticed across of all of them is that even when they do give up the IP to Fate, it never goes outside of Stay Night. If you notice, and I'll put them up on the screen, every time they do a collab, it's always just the Stay Night cast, and it never really goes beyond that. And this even extends to Heaven's Feel with people like Dark Sakura and Salter. So clearly Nasu has no problem with doing anybody from the original cast because he's done it multiple times already, albeit these are just mobile games. The only time that he's really stepped outside of that for an actual fighting game is one that I brought up before. You know, Tsiah, she's the protagonist for Melty Blood. They put her in Under Night. And then recently you have the addition of Edmund, Mash, Ushiwakamaru, and Saber in Melty Blood. Beyond that, you will have a hard time finding any characters that go outside of the norm. And that's really what we're looking for here. People from FGO, people from outside of the main Stay Night canon, because that's where most of the characters are. My thing about them doing any collab in general is that it's hard to see a benefit for them on the same pace as the person that they're giving it to. Because let's be honest, Fate is huge. There's not too many people that they could collab with that's on that same level that would even make it beneficial for them to go out of their way. I mean, if somebody collabs with Tight Moon, who's more than likely going to get the most out of it, them or Tight Moon? So I get why they have it. It would literally take something on the level of a Dokkan or a Genshin for you to even start considering it being worth it. And as far as a fighting game goes, they're very frugal with the characters that they decide to hand out. Ideally, the first characters that come to my mind is the universal mascots. You can't go wrong with that. Even if that's just by word of mouth, would entice people to at least try to check out the game if they haven't heard about it before. When I say that, I'm thinking Saber, Mash, Sion, Edmund, and Uchi would be on the other side where they're very defined to their role, so you would probably only know of them if you're already deep in. I think Emiya would be a good one. I'm surprised that they haven't done him, especially with him playing that lead role to the series. Another thing that you have to look at is how these characters translate into the fighting game. So yeah, they may be a good idea from a promotional standpoint, but would they actually fit into the game from a technical standpoint? You got to consider their move sets, because that can get really defined. Would it be more of a hassle to put this person into a game as opposed to another? And for example, I'll use the ones that they put into Melty Blood, right? Saber and Mash, very vanilla characters in terms of their base design. Saber, straightforward. She doesn't even have her Avalon. She has her sword, she has invisible air, she can do her Excalibur. That's pretty much it. There's nothing else to go through. Same thing with Mash. She has her shield, she can do Camelot. So there's not much that has to go into it in terms of design. It won't be a case where we're waiting a long time for these characters to be built up. The thing that really throws me off is that if Tight Moon isn't willing willing to do super technical characters all the time for their own series, then it's hard to even consider that they'd give that up to somebody else unless they're just taking their hands off of it. He did also mention what would be their special moves, and I feel like that's pretty cut and dry. It would just be their phantasms, whatever case that may be. That's another thing. A lot of characters don't have great phantasms, so you got to consider that also. But it would definitely be their phantasms. The special would be the weaker one, and then maybe their ultimate would be their best one if they decide to go that direction with it. If we take a look at Samurai Remnant, I think they'd be willing to do a lot of characters out of there just because of the nature of the way that the game is made. There's characters there that are straightforward. People like Yamato, I'm sure they'd be more than willing to give him up. You see that they just did the collab with him in FGO, even though he just came out, likely because that very same reason, easy to translate. And speaking of Yamato, pretty much any swordsman for that matter, Musashi, Sasaki, a couple of Knights of the Round, because they all can wield swords, so it really doesn't make too much of a difference. I think a lot of people like Mordred a lot. If I had to just pick somebody out of a lineup and not just my favorite, I hardly ever see anybody speak bad on Mordred, so I think people would be real excited to see her. They would just have to tweak and manipulate it a bit so she doesn't come off as just a Saber clone, and she does have a few things that can make her stand out in a way, but that is her child, so similarities are going to come up. It can't be helped. As a matter of fact, if I just go through each of the cast, it'd probably be easier. So from Apocrypha, I would love to see a Semiramis. I mean, there's such a good cast here. Would love to see Karna and Achilles, but they're much more likely to do Siegfried and Frankenstein. If we use something like Type Redline, absolutely for sure have to get Okita in there. Would love to see people like Nobu, Lee, and Izo, but even for characters like Nobu, it's the same case as Sion, where she's a base projectile user. And if you think about most fighting games, just traditional fighters, it's more so hands-on combat or at least swordsmanship and pole arms. So that in and of itself will be a real curveball on their behalf. I'd be really surprised if they do that. But man, any of these characters will be great. Like I said, they only stand to benefit from putting Type Moon in their game in general, because then you're gonna have people checking it out, especially if the game is worth something. And I can't really see them going out of their way to put their characters in a fighting game unless it's gonna get their response. Mobile games, that's fine because it's not that big of a deal. They give it up and they take their hands off of it. But with a fighter, I'm sure they're gonna want that character to be displayed in the right way. I can't see them doing anybody from Strange Fake, I'm gonna be completely honest. Even people like Gil and Enkidu will be a stretch. Let's not even get into the conceptual characters like No Name Assassin or Jack the Ripper, the Horseman of Pestilence. Yeah, right. Let's be real here. Any of the Lost Belt Kings, the Beast and the Grand, I wish they would, but come on. And it really is a shame because there's so many good characters that they can put in there. You could put Morgan. I will say that King Hassan, considering that he's a swordsman, that might actually work. It's not too overbearing and his setup is pretty simple. So out of all the people that might really take you by surprise, he would be one of the ones that's the most realistic. Even getting into people like Muramasa is a stretch because he has an entire reality marble, so that just completely goes into a different realm. And you know, going back to the swordsman thing, you notice the character that they decided to use out of Babylonia for Melty Blood, right? They chose Ushiwakamaru. Now, why did they do that? Think about it. Everybody else is too powerful and everybody else has too much going on. And in terms of adapting, they'd have to really put some muscle into that to bring somebody else. Could have brought over Leonidas, but again, Leonidas is a defensive character, so can't really use him either. Could have used Benkei, but most people don't care about Benkei, if we're being honest. So they knew with Ushi being an actual fan favorite, they said, hey, we can bring her over. She's a swordsman. It makes sense. It's not gonna take too much. Why not? Oh yeah, I forgot about Ozzy. See, people like Ozzy would be really good, but he has an entire temple that he can drop on people. You gotta give my boy the light at some point. Yeah, they definitely do cool. Even though his phantasm is really conceptual based, at the core of his character, he's a close range specialist, so that shouldn't be too hard for them to do. And they already gave him up for Remnant, so if we needed any template for what they'd be willing to go for, that's one right there. As far as the mages go, who would be a model mage to represent the Type Moon verse? I think Alko would be a real good one. That would be another way to get her character around. Though she may be powerful, her kit is pretty straightforward. Absolutely, people like Kirei and Rin just for the sake of them having their Baji Swan, or anybody that has that close range fighting ability. People like Kazuki, but many people don't know Kazuki, and he's also not magical based, so I doubt they do him. Man, there's really so many. Luvia, if we're talking about characters that will be super interesting that I know we're not getting, Galahad, Melt, and King Protea, Solomon, Romulus, Vlad, Nero, Flat, Wuhiji, and Ergo from El Malloy, Alice. And you know, something that they should have been done is make an unlimited codes too, like a more modern version with a different system, or elevate the system that they had before, like completely rebuild it from scratch. That could work, because that's really what most people want, and that's a whole video in and of itself. People just want a Type Moon fighting game in general. We put it into the air quite a bit. They seem like they're not interested whatsoever. They do toss out characters here and there to other series and even Melty Blood, but as far as making something like that on its own, I haven't seen anything like it. They don't know the response that it'll get, because most of the things that they put out so far hasn't been of that nature, so I guess they don't know what to expect. But even with titles like Extella and FGO, they should know that if it gets out over here and it's really good, it's gonna do well for certain, just like Remnant. I'd be willing to bet that it'd do better than Remnant, and we already know Remnant is like a 4 out of 5 game. Like everywhere I look, Remnant is like at least an 8 out of 10. So for me to say that lets you know they should hop on that. They should have been hopped on that.